welcome. Episode 93, Our Score LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Yes, it is. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. It's been a good week. Busy, but pleasant overall. Yourself?
Yeah, I'd say the same. Definitely busy. But, on the whole, I think busy's better than bored.
I'll always take work over just sitting around. No, I won't, actually. I'll just sit around.
I was going to say, hang on. That actually makes me wonder what you're drinking today.
It's a whiskey sour. A little bit of an offbeat choice, but this, oddly enough, goes back to my high school days. This is one of the first drinks I ever used to have, was a whiskey sour. I got Woodford Reserve in this one. So, an interesting drink. What about you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think this might be the first time we've ever both been drinking like good old brown liquor. I have made what's called a Manhattan 101. And the 101 comes from the fact that I have poured some Wild Turkey 101 into this bad boy. This is about as strong as it gets. I think this thing would take the paint off my walls. It's got a couple types of vermouth and some bitters in there. And I did it right. I followed the Dave advice or approach today where I actually did order all of the ingredients. So I have made this by the book, basically.
Well, we'll have to track this podcast and see how loose it gets by the time, we're done with it in the next 45 or 60 minutes or so.
If we can keep it closer to 45, I think we'll hold it together. 60 minutes, the wheels may come off.
Some heavy liquor going down.
Yeah. Well, I know part of the reason you and I are both drinking is that it hasn't all been sunshine this week. There have been a couple unfortunate deaths, one of which has led to a song and the other's just led to me drinking.
Let's start with the one that led to you drinking.
Yeah, pour one out for good old Norm Macdonald, one of my absolute favorite comedians of all time. He passed away, I think, yesterday at 61, after almost a decade-long silent battle with cancer. Even his close friends apparently didn't know.
I had no idea. It was a big surprise when I saw the news yesterday.
I didn't realize he was sick, but that is just about the most Norm thing to do, which is keep it to yourself for 9 years. But he was just an uncompromising comedian's comedian. The people you think of as the funniest people thought of him as the funniest people.
That's good.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he's now gone, and we can also pour one out for Sarah Harding, 1/5 of the immense group Girls Aloud. She passed away last week after about a 1.5 year long battle. And that has actually led to our song choice because, as John has often made fun of me, Girls Aloud, probably my favorite band in the world. I had so many great choices of music to choose from. I won't run through it because that would be a whole podcast episode. But the song I've chosen is Swinging London Town, which is kind of like a party, girls out on the town song. Great tune if you've never heard it. If you like pop music at all, they jam. And unfortunately, sorry to see Sarah go because she was a big part of that band. And I was hoping they were going to do a reunion tour. They've been talking about it, so I don't think that's going to be happening now. Or if it is, it's going to be something very different than they intended it to be.
Yeah, it's tough to do a reunion when 20% of your band is unavailable.
Not to be too bleak about it, but it becomes a memorial tour at that point.
Yeah. In fact, I'm hoping this doesn't become a recurring theme in the podcast. This little intro in memoriam.
I don't like it when, people I like musically pass away. It's depressing. But if they do go on tour, I will guarantee you, John, that I'm going no matter what.
Yeah, COVID be damned. You'll be there, front and center, in the mosh pit. They have mosh pits.
The only thing that would draw me out of the house would be a Girls Aloud tour. So,
well, you've already turned down a birthday invitation for me next month in Vegas.
That's correct.
So I see where I stand in relation to Girls Aloud. Thanks a lot.
Your birthday happens every year. Girls Aloud tours haven't happened now in well over a decade. So,
fair enough. Well, I hope you get a chance to see them. And yeah, R.I.P. Sarah.
Yeah.
All right. You want to talk a little bit about the LSAT world? See if we can infuse
the
this
end of the
thing
podcast.
with some sunshine. I know. It does. It does feel like we could wrap it up right there and just go drink.
I'm in that kind of mood today, but let's talk about what's going on in the LSAT world. And the very first item is actually what we're going to come back around to, and that was that the August score release occurred this past Friday. And so all I'll say is that's our topic for tonight. We're going to talk about the results a little bit and what we know about the numbers and so forth. So that was the first thing. The other thing you've got is the October test time registration, where you choose your day and date, that is actually coming up in a week or so. That opens on September 23rd.
Yeah, next Thursday.
Yeah, and you'll be able to choose a testing date that's either Saturday, October 9th, Sunday, October 10th, or Tuesday, October 12th. Those are the main test administration dates. Paper and pencil test takers will test on Thursday, October 14th.
Yeah, I checked the registrant numbers right before we got on the mics here, and it's about 33,000 people signed up for that test right now. That will drop a little bit as people withdraw or transfer or move things to a later date. But I expect somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30,000 people to take that test, which leads me to a bit of advice, which is when those slots open up next Thursday around noon Eastern time, typically, you don't have to rush to do it, but there is a sense of urgency because it's first come, first serve. And with that many people, some of the spots will start to fill up. So if you want to test, say, on Sunday afternoon, go ahead and do it as soon as possible. Go ahead and get your spot picked out because other people are gunning for it too, potentially.
Yeah, they usually have plenty of time spaces. So even if you couldn't get your specific time, there's going to be something within 20 minutes before or after usually.
Typically. Yeah, we did see by about a day into the August selection, things were beginning to get a little bit full. So be mindful of that. You don't have to be there right at noon on Thursday, but I wouldn't wait until, say, the weekend if you can help it.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about, well, does it matter when I choose to take the test or the time I pick? We actually talked about this in podcast episode 69. We talked about how to choose the ideal LSAT flex time. Now, it's not a flex test any longer, but the principles still remain exactly the same as when we talked about it then.
Yeah, the guidance there was really just about how to pick the ideal day and time for yourself, regardless of the test format. It still holds.
Yeah, the extra experimental section on the new modern LSAT does not matter whatsoever.
So modern. Yeah, speaking of upcoming tests that aren't flex, let's also talk a little bit about November, because that is at least the next LSAT that people can get signed up for at this point. And they did something rather interesting very recently. We talked about this in our crystal ball on Sunday night. I'll mention it again here for anyone who wasn't in attendance. They have shifted the dates for November up by a day. So that test, instead of starting on a Saturday, actually starts on Friday, November 12th. And then we'll run Friday, Saturday, Sunday, so the 12th, 13th, and 14th. On Tuesday of that week is when they're going to do the accommodated test for paper and pencil people.
Yeah, a Friday, Saturday, Sunday alignment sounds like the worst kind of long weekend for me. 3 days of not even a break in there, just 3 days back to back of tracking everything that we can get our hands on. I'm not looking forward to that. They did make that change, however, to, I believe, kind of avoid Thanksgiving as creating a problem for the score release that they're doing and I guess the processing of the test. I don't know exactly how that lines up, but that's my understanding. And if you are looking to register for that test, you have about 2 weeks right now. The registration deadline is September 29th. And I think that'll be a reasonable sized LSAT as well. It's also a test that if you take the November test, the results are back early enough that there is absolutely no concern about, is this an early enough LSAT? Yeah. It definitely is, and it is especially so in this type of year where we know that the cycle is going to be slower. And that's something that I actually talked about during the Q&A on the Crystal Ball. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we even talked about some of this in the student mailbag episode that we just did. The idea of, is January too late or is January worthwhile? The fact that January is not too late says everything you need to know about November. Clearly well in time for any kind of application cycle. I think part of the reason that this has been adjusted is to avoid makeup tests the following week, falling on Thursday, I guess it'd be the 25th, which I think is actually Thanksgiving Day. So I'm guessing the makeups of that week will probably be Tuesday.
You're exactly right. That is the actual explanation now that I'm sure.
Perfect.
I was a little slow there.
No, will you just say that again?
I was right. You're a little slow.
I was going to say, hearing you say that's exactly right, that tastes better than this cocktail. I won't, yeah.
You didn't expect that. I was going to turn that around that quick.
Well, anyway, it's on tape. You've all heard it.
No, you didn't. Anyway, one thing that we've been asked a lot about recently, and again, this came up in the crystal ball as well, was the idea of, will they release that elusive prep test that they have said that they will release?
Yeah, PT90.
Do we know anything about it? Has there been any kind of update or confirmation? There hasn't been. I obviously ask as much as I possibly can without driving them nuts, and I haven't gotten an exact date on it. I continue to think that the chances of it being released prior to the October LSAT are extremely high. Is it guaranteed? No, you can never guarantee anything in life, but that is something that I feel is pretty strongly going to happen. Of course, now that I've said I don't know the exact date, they'll probably release it before this even comes out tomorrow, but I'm hoping that it is relatively soon, at least sometime in the next 2 weeks, so that people have time to review a new prep test and see what was going on with that.
Yeah. If you somehow jinx it into coming sooner, I don't think anybody'd be too mad at you.
No, I don't. They shouldn't be. It's only good.
That's right. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. And obviously, as soon as we know any more details, we'll post them. Dave's Twitter, for instance, is always a good resource for that sort of thing.
Yeah, as soon as I hear about it, I'll post it on Twitter, and that's usually within just a few minutes of it happening. And there's another thing we did, we've mentioned the crystal ball a few times. That has been posted into our online student centers for PowerScore students. We've also uploaded the recommended question sets, whether that was collections of logic games or reading comprehension or what have you, various sections that we thought were really useful. We've created that new crystal ball problem set and posted that as well. What do you think the chances are, John, that we'll do a crystal ball specifically for the November LSAT?
I'd say they're decreasing with every sip. They're a lot of work, but they tend to be predicated on emerging information, on us learning something unique or novel compared to the last one that we did, and that motivates us to get out there and broadcast it. So I guess the best I could see is, I don't know if I'm going to play an odds game with you, but I'd frame it this way. If something interesting happens either in October or with this test release, I think that would be sufficient cause for us to do a new one. Failing either of those two things, though, I think everything we talked about this past Sunday holds true for November, and we might be off the hook.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. Those are the 2 points that we'll be analyzing most closely. The October LSAT and then any test that is released. And depending upon what we see with those, if anything, then we'll do one. If we don't feel it's notable, then we'll simply say that what we did this past weekend is going to continue riding on as the current version of that.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it. Part of me hopes that something really interesting happens because, well, then something interesting happened. But part of me also really just wants to keep things steady and stable and predictable. So I think the bigger portion of me leans towards consistency through October in this test release, that we won't have to do a new one. But again, we're not opposed to it if needed.
I'm betting that we will end up having to do it. I will say this in advance. It won't be on Sunday night. No more Sunday night crystal balls. It wrecks my weekend. Saturday night, I have to just sit around and do nothing and make sure that I'm ready to go on Sunday. So that's not going to happen. It's going to be like on a Tuesday or a Wednesday next time.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. So,
it's funny, people
always ask us in those crystal balls what we're drinking. And I guess we've established a certain, reputation. But what we always tell them is that during live events like that, where we actually have a proper audience, we tend to abstain. Versus something like this, where it's just you and me kind of chatting.
Let's be honest. If we screw up something terrible here, we could go back and re-record it, But and honestly, we really don't. We very rarely stop any kind of recording that we're doing. It is once in a very blue moon. But I don't want to be on kind of like in a live webinar with hundreds of people and then thousands of people listening to it afterwards and get that loose. So it's not going to change anytime soon. It's going to be water from me in almost every crystal ball, but certainly not on the podcast because we don't have that restriction.
Yeah, the podcast almost feels like an afternoon off compared to crystal
pretty
balls.
Enjoyable for us to do it. I don't know
right.
how enjoyable it is to listen to.
Well, you mentioned this before, and I think the time has come to circle back to it. Let's talk about the August 2021 test results that just came out for people last Friday. Because I think this was a score release that caught a lot of people either off guard in terms of the results or at least had some surprising elements to it.
That's exactly the case. And I will say this. I think a good portion of this conversation is going to be interesting for people who took the August test, but also those who did not. Because we're going to talk about some scoring trends and we're going to go back and discuss that scoring bubble idea that was such a big focus of last year's admissions process. So this is something that will apply to people who are taking in October and November in terms of their understanding. So it's not just, oh, did I take August? Yes, I'll listen. Oh, I didn't take August. I'm going to leave. This is something that is actually reflective of what appears to be certain trends that are occurring with LSAT scoring right now.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So let's talk about it. How would you say it turned out? Almost a preview of what we're going to explore.
I thought it was a really interesting day. So scores came out around 9 a.m. on September 10th, which is actually 9 a.m. Eastern. So it was 6 a.m. For you and I, John. And
Yeah.
I was up and started talking to students immediately. And most of the people I was speaking to were Power Score students.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them on Twitter, some of them in various other forums and channels. And what I found immediately was this felt like a throwback test to me. This felt very much like last summer. I had a number of students who had extremely high scores, an early run of people talking about, I have mid 170s, 178, 173, these types of scores, really powerful scores, and a lot of cases where people were telling me, I've hit my average or I've performed better than my last prep test by several points. Like I've broken my average significantly or even sometimes achieved my highest score yet. So I was in a bubble like that. I think you were a little bit later to get started than I was, which was happiness for you.
I will make no apologies for not being up at 6 a.m.
I tend to rise earlier than John is what I'm really saying in an indirect fashion, and he sleeps in.
Yeah.
So I'm talking to our students, and I had a very interesting view of it. I was like, this test is going great. I feel really good about everything that I'm seeing. I've got a ton of happy students. And then I got a couple messages from people who, interestingly, weren't directly our students, but they were like, so this test looks like it had really brutal results. Do you think that there was some kind of problem with the exam? And I was like, what are you talking about? It's like, everything I'm hearing right now is just like roses. And it turns out that on some of the forums, notably Reddit, that a number of people had seen score drops. And there was kind of a concern that something abnormal had happened, that there'd been this big reversal. And so I looked at a few of those later on in the day. It took me about 6-7 hours to get to it. And I certainly saw what people were expressing in terms of their concerns. And I always hate to read posts like that, because the last thing you want is to read about somebody who had a 165 average and then got a 155 on the test. It's just such a disappointment, certainly for them, but even for me, whether or not they were our student. And it's one of those things you look at and you just feel badly for others. Mm-hmm. I will say this, and then we're going to go into the data right afterwards, and we'll circle back to this. This was very reminiscent of the flex test last year. I saw this exact same thing, a ton of super high scores, and then a bunch of people who had unprecedented score drops. Part of that is because this online format and the shorter form, 3 sections, 4 sections, as the case may be, has a higher degree of variability in scoring outcomes. We already saw them take the score band from 3 to 4 in terms of like what the deviation, the error of measurement is. So we know that there's more variation. That doesn't make anybody feel better about going down 8 or 10 points, but this wasn't abnormal. And as it turns out, and we'll dive into this right now, this test was more similar to these flex tests than perhaps we expected it was going to be.
Yeah, you've done a deep dive here and actually compiled a bunch of very interesting and I think insightful numbers so that we don't have to talk about this in theory. We can actually chart it out. This is very objectified in the way that you've done it.
Yeah. Now I have to say that it's not really me. It's I've collated it.
You're the guy who at least tabulated all this stuff and put it.
You and I will incisively analyze it.
Right.
But I give credit to LSAC for kind of coming out with this information. They sent out a really transparent email on the afternoon of score release, and they sent it to a bunch of advisors and so forth. And so we ended up getting like 40 copies of it. And it was one of these things where they give a rundown of what they're seeing from a preliminary standpoint. And I will stress that it's preliminary. It's not the full data set. There's still people who have scores yet to come in, as we'll see in a moment, and there's still people yet to cancel their scores. And this doesn't contain score band information, which will be fascinating when we get it, because that'll really confirm whether or not we have a score bubble. But the early signs, as we will see, show that we do most likely have that occurring again. So I'm using a lot of what they said in their email. I think it's great that they send this kind of stuff out. And it's also going to help us because when we start talking about the possible causes that people might have had their scores drop, we're going to point back to this more than once.
Yeah.
And say, look, they've already kind of released the data on this. It's going to be really hard for you to make that argument. So I think this kind of gives LSAC some degree of protection against criticism, and that's why they put all this information out. And I think this year the messaging is probably going to try to be very clear on what's happening with scores, because law schools had a lot of trouble last year, and they need that clear communication because the numbers were unstable compared to prior years, and they need to know if that's going to continue or whether that's going to change. So let's talk about what we saw.
For sure. Yeah. Gotta love data like this. It means people don't just have to take us at our word. Our suspicions really get superseded by hard data, and that's great. So,
Yeah.
how many people took it? Maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, as of the morning of score release, they had sent scores out to 21,024 test takers, which is a fairly substantial amount. But interestingly enough, over 3,800 people had not yet completed their LSAT writing at that time or had a hold on their score for some other reason. And so they didn't have those scores. And that's a ton of people right there. That's 1/8, a little more than 1/8 of the entire population there that was still waiting to get their results. So 9,000 of those people have score preview and they could cancel. So that will ultimately affect the score band information. That's why we won't be able to say right now there were this many 175 to 180s. They don't release preliminary info, only final recorded scores. So we won't be able to say there were X number of people in the 170 to 175 range and so forth.
Yeah, let me elaborate on that one point, that number there about score preview. Because what I saw when I eventually did wake up to conservatively about 200 messages from people.
I thought you were going to say conservatively at 2 p.m.
I made the AM that morning. I knew it was a big day. I tend to live more in like Hawaii time. And
you knew I had it covered. So
Dave's the reliable one. I will say collectively, I think you and I are awake around 22 hours a day.
Yeah.
So yeah, the only overlap is from about 3 to 5 a.m. where we're both asleep. But if 9,000 people who took this test had score preview, what that tells you is that 9,000 people who took this were taking it for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And that to me was one of the big splits or separators that I saw, almost a predictor of result. I saw a number of first-timers get really staggered by score drops, but I didn't see it from hardly anyone who was taking this test a second, third, fifth time. Particularly our students that I talked to, as you mentioned, they had great results, but a lot of first-timers, I think, were a little shell-shocked. And that suggests why that might have been the case. 9,000 first-timers here in August.
Yeah, the percentage was pretty healthy. They actually released that was in there. But it is an interesting thing because, part of me wants to say, look, Power Score students in general did really well, and it was the non-Power Score students who suffered. And, of course, it's how I feel like, well, we think we do a pretty good job, so that's the way we'd like to see it. That's not always the case. There's always someone out there who's like, well, I just struggled, and we'll talk about why those reasons exist for those types of problems. But that's still a lot of scores that could still be canceled out of this. So that'll really have a material impact on how many people we have in each band, and that's what will tell us for sure whether or not we have a score bubble. That data is some time away. It's at least a couple of weeks away, I think, from being released. Right now, there are no updates that are being given as far as new daily kind of like score updates because they closed their season.
Yeah.
Each cycle ends kind of in the fall and begins anew in the same fall. And so the last cycle just closed on August 8th. The new cycle data hasn't started to be uploaded. And so we're just waiting for that to begin. And once we begin with that, we'll be able to very quickly say this is what the reality is.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
Let's take a look kind of at the second thing, which is what LSAC actually said about it, because it strongly suggests that we probably do still have a score bubble.
Right.
All right. Now, in the email, they said that scores for the August 2021 LSAT are consistent with and comparable to scores for the 3-section LSAT Flex administered over the past year. Well, I think that says very strongly that we're probably looking at a score bubble again because it says it's comparable to. All right. It means that it's similar to. And in fact, they released a kind of cool little graph that showed the mean scores on each LSAT going back really into the 2016 range. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to just read some of these. I'm going to kind of show you what happened in terms of just using the July, August, and September tests over the last 6 years. And we're going to use what is the mean score on those exams, and it'll show you how it starts to rise at the end. So September 2016, The mean score on the LSAT was 152.25. Now that sounds like, wait, scores are already above 150. I'm just isolating September and really this kind of like July, August, September range because we're talking about the August 2021 score release. We're looking for the most similar data point in the past.
Yeah, late summer, early fall from prior years where this test would slot in.
Yeah. Now, other tests in that same year data set showed like 148 as the mean. So it all ends up being around 150 or so, and it offsets. And this is natural. It happens every year. It's one of the reasons where last year, when the numbers looked a little bit inflated, LSAC's response to it was, no, it'll come back down. It does all the time. They had justification for believing that. So 152.25 back in 2016. You go to September 2017, it was 152.6. Really similar. You go to July 2018, it was 152.83. In July 2019, it was 152.88. You're starting to get kind of like a pattern here. It's all in that 152 range, typically in the middle. Then we go to August 2020. And where are we at now? We are in the midst of the flex test. We're at the depths of the pandemic. Here's the mean in August 2020, 155.6. So we already know that LSAC's explanation of this, bolstered by the data that they have received from surveying students, is that people were studying more. They were stuck inside. They had more time on their hands. They spent more time. They don't think that it was the 3-section test. They didn't adjust the scales for these tests. They said, we're going to use the scales that we know have been established in the past. The mean goes up 3 points.
Yeah. After 4 cycles in a row where it only increased about 0.6, suddenly it jumps 3 full points.
Yep. It's a big jump there. It's a mean, so it doesn't tell you the composition of each score band. So that's why I'm like, you can't actually see it. But that's reflective of like some type of upward pressure. Now, we come to August 2021. What do we see? It's dropped a little bit. But did it drop back down to 152.6 or 8? No. It dropped down just about a point, maybe a little closer to 1.4. It dropped to 154.19. So what does that tell you? It wasn't as kind of like robust and healthy as the mean was in August 2020. It's a little bit down from that, but it's still 2 points higher from what it was previously, almost 2 points. And so we still are seeing that kind of like upward pressure here. It's just not as bad as it was last year. And that tells you right away that when you look at the overall aggregate of people, you still have a higher mean than you did in the prior test for 4 years of that. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's not quite as inflated as last year's August test was, but it's still well above the 4 years prior. So what this tells me, and I'm sure you're going to agree, we do still have this score bubble on our hands. It might have shrunk a little, but it's definitely still inflated, especially at the higher ends.
Yeah, I'd say it's almost certain that we're going to end up with that bubble still. And slightly deflated, but not completely deflated is a good way to actually put it. We've talked about the possible causes of this in prior episodes. We're not going to cover, why is there a scoring bubble? There's a lot of different possible explanations, some of them more plausible than others.
Yeah, we went into some great depth in this in our episode on why this cycle is so competitive, referencing the one that just wrapped up. But if you want to learn more about what has just occurred, that episode is comprehensive.
It really is. And the interesting thing is there were comments, especially on Reddit, which is, a hotbed of conspiracy theory on almost every forum at any given time, not just our LSAT. There was some discussion of like, this test was rigged or they did something weird with the scale. And that's why we saw some of these score drops. We'll bring this around and talk about it again momentarily. But when you see that the mean aggregate was 2 points higher than some of these tests in the past, that really is a strong suggestion that that's not the case. And there was no conspiracy. Nothing was rigged. They didn't do anything special to try to destroy the hopes and dreams of hundreds and hundreds of people.
Thousands. Yeah, we'll come back to that and start to explore some of those. I'm doing air quotes around conspiracies, but that is a pretty good word for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a theory.
Right.
But it feels conspiratorial because you're like, those guys at LSAC are out to get me. And I can understand that. Sometimes it does feel that way. They also release some additional information about the effect, or really lack thereof, the experimental actually was having. And they say that after a detailed analysis, They could say with assurance that the addition of the unscored section did not have any meaningful impact on test taker scores for August 2021. They looked at all sorts of different things. And I will point out that, students have asked me, why was this score release an extra week later than the prior score releases? It was precisely so they could make sure that there was no problems with the experimental section. They gave themselves an extra week here to make sure that all the data analyses they were doing processing stacked it up so that this test was valid, which is just a smart thing to do. When you come in with a new test kind of format, no matter what the change is, even if it's reintroducing a section that used to be on this test, what should you do? You should slow down and make sure you have time to analyze everything and, ensure the integrity of the test. So they gave themselves more time. They looked at it, sliced and diced it. And they say a few things. It does not matter where your experimental section is. They ran tests where it was first and it was fourth, and just kind of flipped it. Didn't have any type of impact. So it doesn't matter about section order according to them or placement. Now, I rather cheekily tweeted that, yeah, that's nice, but if you started off with RC, then RC is your sections, it sure is hard to buy into that it had no effect. And what I would say to that is this. This is, again, the aggregate of performance. So I think it does affect certain test takers. And they're like, hey, yeah, I just got worked over by those two sections. But there's another person down the street who's like, oh my gosh, I just got the best section order that I could possibly get for myself. And so all these things blend together and it ends up right about the same as usual. But they may say, gee, it doesn't matter where it is. That's for the aggregate. That's the collective of people. It doesn't mean anything for you, the individual.
Yeah, this is clearly a case where individual preferences and outcomes and call it penalties get really watered down, almost nullified by the collective experience that this measures.
Yeah. If you don't like reading and you really love logic games and your test starts off RC, RC, LR, LG, I think there's no question whatsoever it has a negative effect on your performance. But somebody else got the reverse, and they're much happier about it. And so it's all a wash because it turns into averages ultimately, but that does not take into account the individual. So just because you've heard us say this, just because they've said it, yes, it's true on the overall level, doesn't mean anything for you individually. You can still get screwed by section order.
Yeah, this is the old LSAC casino thing that we always touch on. Luck of the draw in so many ways.
Indeed. LSAT Casino, probably my favorite vision related to the LSAT itself.
That is a Dave Kaloran original. TM.
For your Vegas birthday, if you guys could set up an LSAT Casino for me, I might think about showing up.
Yeah, all right. Fair enough. No, if that's the bet, I'll take the bet.
You get Caesars just put up lines on LSAT related bets. I think I probably have to show up for that.
I was just going to have a deck of cards and some dominoes in my hotel room. I thought that'd be enough.
It's got to be official. I need Caesars to be involved in it.
Fair enough. We'll see. I'll do what I can, but I won't be holding my breath to see you.
I know. That's why I don't expect to be there.
All of that said, it is impossible to deny the fact that at least for a fair number of people, scores did drop, sometimes precipitously. And I don't think we could get away with having this discussion without addressing some possible, even probable causes for what might have led to that, again, on an individual outcome basis.
Yeah, let's kind of go through why it is some people might have seen score drops, kind of address that conspiracy theory one more time and put that to bed. What do you think the first, possible cause of a score drop would be for somebody?
Well, theoretically, one of the ones that I've seen posited by more than a few people is that LSAC made mistakes. LSAC incorrectly graded or scored people's results. You really did get a 170, but they reported a 160 because they screwed up processing your performance, your score.
Meaning on an individual basis, not overall.
Yeah.
But
I'm not saying that there was some widespread trend that we're aware of. I'm saying that this has been one of the theories people are kicking around as to why their score might have dropped.
Exactly. Have we seen this ever happen before, John, where they did make a mistake on somebody's score and posted to their account the wrong score?
Yeah, regrettably, there's at least one instance, a rather infamous instance, that you and I are both aware of.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a long time ago, and I'm not aware of any since, but back when LSAC lost however many hundreds of people's scores, it seems like a crazy sentence to even say out loud, and we're going back and individually retrieving them best they could, watching the videos of people trying to, like, again, recalibrate or calculate their answer choices. I know at least one person scored in the 170s and got a reported score in the 130s.
Yep.
So there was a 40-point difference in how they did versus what they received.
And then they had that score changed after it was reviewed. Now, here's the thing about that. I am not aware of really too many other, if any, other reported instances where someone had their score changed. So that's the one and only. I understand now why that happened. Having talked to LSAC about it, they say that they've put protocols in place so that specific problem will never reoccur. And I don't see any reason why you wouldn't believe them in that case. It just makes good sense for them to want to have the scores be valid.
Yeah, I think they chased that issue down to a software glitch or a software problem, and they have since corrected it.
It was some kind of data transfer that was coming into them, if I recall. But regardless of the actual cause, it doesn't really matter to us at this point. If you're in a situation where you feel like, well, maybe they did mess up my test, there is a way to have your scores looked at. You can pay for a score audit to occur where they'll go back in and individually look at it. And that might result in any of three things. You get a higher score and they found a problem and it turns out it's in your favor. Your score might stay exactly the same. Or what would be even worse is they could actually lower your score if they found out a mistake was made that they missed that actually hurt your results. So there's no kind of like, oh, you can only go up. Now, look, the chances are really likely that there's nothing going on there and your score is your score. But you can, if you're really kind of like paranoid, and I'm not sure that's an unreasonable feeling, especially in society today. If you're paranoid about these things, you can be like, well, I really just want to make sure I don't trust them. A lot of people are going to say, I don't trust any kind of like, oversight authority. And so that score audit is one of really the only avenue you have to addressing that here.
Yeah, and it's not free unless they've made a mistake, and then they will actually refund you if your score goes up. So that would be the happiest of outcomes, but as you mentioned, it's not the only possible outcome. For me to ever chase down a score audit, I think it would take overwhelming evidence, just where no other alternative explanation, aside from an error on LSAC's part, could explain the discrepancy between how I'd been performing and what I actually got. My score dropped 32 points or something. Like something's happened on the back end because there's no way I did that.
That's what happened with the person who actually got their score changed. Is they're like, look, my practice testing was in the 170s. I've never been below 160 something, and now they're telling me that I got a 130. No way. It's an impossibility to believe. And so there was like something compelling about that, and there was already a known issue going around that particular exam. There is no similar known issue that is floating around this exam, as we already know. And as we just talked about with the numbers, in fact, the upward pressure on the scores is still there from before. So it starts to look like if you had that type of reversal, it was more of an outlier performance by you. But let's just cover all the bases here, because we might talk about the fact that there was an individual problem. A lot of people on Reddit really looked at it in a much more global sense, and perhaps corporate sense. They're like, what if it is a conspiracy? What if LSAC has gone in here and either made some kind of terrible mistake, like they've miscounted the experimental section and included my misses from that? Or maybe they wanted to stop this score bubble, and so they created a super hard scale, or they made this a super hard test. These are some of the things that I saw online. Like, these are the explanations that could be out there. And the motivation is they had that score bubble problem, and they want to put an end to that. Yeah. What's your take on that as a possible set of explanations?
I think it's slightly more plausible than the first one. In fact, as we outline these various theories, I'll elaborate as always. But I think as we outline these various theories, we can almost assign like a plausibility score to each. So the first possible cause here is that LSAC has actually made a number of mistakes for individuals and has misreported a bunch of different people's scores, and that's the drop. I think the plausibility of that, if I'm ranking it or scoring it, is virtually zero. The second theory here is that LSAC has done this not by mistake, by intent. That there's almost this purposeful malice on LSAC's part where they have done something truly aggressively cruel with the test that they gave people, and maybe the scale that they ended up using. Maybe scores dropped as much for some people because LSAC designed it to be that way. My take on that is that Again, I see no evidence of that. We know these tests pretty well at this point. We've seen what's happened. You can see from the numbers you just quoted in the means, this was not a test of overwhelming or unique difficulty. I don't really see much novelty at all to what has happened here in August.
I will go several steps further. It's not just that there's no evidence for it. There's a considerable amount of evidence against it. We just went through the listing of the mean LSAT scores and showed that the mean on this test was above 154, at least a point and a half higher than all the tests from 16, 17, 18, and 19. The idea that they made some kind of super hard scaling on this, or it was a super hard test and it was designed to reverse what had happened before, it's completely disproven here. It's still elevated compared to what the norm is historically. And so it's really, to me, very solid evidence that there was not some type of intent here or malicious conspiracy. And I'll point something out. I didn't expect it to just drop back down to normal because I thought that would have been more suspicious than anything. Through the summer when we knew we had a score bubble, we continued to see a lot of scores in the upper ranges, and it kind of maintained itself. Again, a point we've talked about previously. If it suddenly went right back down after this test, and the data will come out, it would be really clear that they had done that. And they've got a bunch of people like you and I watching them like hawks. That just seems like a really dumb kind of approach when you know that eventually it's all going to come out. They'd be like, you just set that test and just curved it down so hard with the scale that you crushed everybody. You did that on purpose. That was unfair.
Right.
As soon as you have people leveling charges of unfairness at you about the scoring integrity of your test, you would lose, all credibility. They can't afford to let that happen. And so the way I look at it is they just kept on going. And I imagine at the end of the day, when they have all their surveys and results, they're going to say, well, people studied a little bit less for this test than they did in the past. And perhaps that dropped that mean down a little bit. But the conspiracy theory to me is dead. It's just dead on arrival here, and the data just kills it. So plausibility, 0.
Yeah, this was dead in my mind before we even had those numbers because we can track source tests that they used here in August. I think the biggest one being the October 2020 flex test from last year. So again, not only was there nothing particularly unique about the nature of what was being presented, given to people, and the numbers bear that out, but we've even seen this exact content happen previously, and we know the results there weren't, again, overly punitive. So yeah, this one's dead in the water too.
Yeah, and as I said before, they gave themselves an extra week to check everything. So they already had built in a bit of a fail-safe here to look at it, which really brings up the question then, all those posts on Reddit that were kind of coming out, why were they there? What's going on with that? And, what does it really tell us from a bigger picture standpoint? You want to address it or you want me to?
I think we'll probably address it in a few parts, but one comment that I would make to that is it's very easy, I think, to look at this. If you were a test taker and you've just taken August and then you're on Reddit as other people get their scores back, it's very easy to look at each of these moments that you were involved in as being particularly distinctive or unique. But the fact is, we hear these types of reports, good and bad, every test release day. People were saying this in June. People said this last, January. My score dropped. I don't know what happened. So hearing reports like that never catch me by surprise too much because we always hear them. The second comment I'd make is that Reddit is a particularly dubious source for accurate reporting. It is, if you'll bear with me, it's fake news in many instances. Not a person I thought I'd be quoting today, but there we are.
I'm surprised, actually.
Yeah. For once, he might have a good point. In terms of Reddit, what you see from people, it's amplified. It's this megaphone effect. It's the same thing with like Yelp reviews. Nobody who has a good meal bothers to go on Yelp. But if it's the best meal of your life or the worst experience, oh my God, I found a shoelace in my soup. That's the kind of thing you go talk about. And I think that's what you often see with these outlier results from people is they're the ones who actually take the time to go broadcast it.
Yeah, in the pre-forum days, you really wouldn't hear from students who didn't do that well on a test like this because people who had bad experience tended not to talk about it.
Right.
You'd get phone calls or emails from individuals who'd done really well because they were elated. And I think you mentioned that megaphone effect of Reddit. These days, if somebody has had a bad experience, they go on to a forum, and what they're really seeing is commiseration by others who are like, I had that same experience. And it's really a supporting kind of thing. Like, I didn't do well. Did that happen to anyone else? And it feels good in some respects when someone else is like, same thing happened to me. Like, I'm not alone in this boat. And so I think that you're exactly right. When you are on the ends of the spectrum in terms of results, like you got a much higher score, a great score, better than you expected, and then you got a worse score, worse than anything you've done, those individuals are much more likely to post. But if you go out and you look at, say, 12 or 15 posts like, I didn't do well on this, that's anecdotal. There are thousands and thousands of people who took this exam, and there's plenty of instances where they didn't go down 10 points. But of course, Reddit pulls out that type of individual who wants to kind of express their opinion. I love Reddit. I love that forum. I think it's a ton of interesting information there. And I love the fact that almost all the students who use it are really dedicated. But it does give a distorted picture of things. For example, a lot of people on there would say, oh, I have a score of 165 or higher. We know from the percentiles that's not normal. And so it kind of gives you this bizarre mirror world vision of people who are really, really engaged in it and who thereby are much more likely to talk about it when anything abnormal happens to them. But abnormal, when it's all collected together, becomes normal because it all offsets. If we have two people with a 165 average and one goes out and gets a 172 and the other gets a 158, they might both post about their experiences. They're still just averaging out to 165 like they were before.
Yeah, you mentioned the distortion effect that this creates, and that's exactly what it is. And I think it's important that people recognize the nature of what these posts tend to encourage from fellow Redditors. So if I were to post and they're like, man, my score dropped 10 points, anybody else? An honest survey would have a lot of people responding, not me. No, didn't happen. But what you get instead are only the ones who want to get in there and echo chamber affirm, I had that same experience. So again, it grossly distorts the distributions, the proportionality, the reality of what actually happened.
And it's not done by intent. Nobody's trying to make anything or do anything bad. It's just like, hey, you want to share what happened and you're frustrated and you're like, could it have been something that was not my fault and could have been something that was bigger than me? Let me find out. I think it's an honest effort to actually get information and understanding. But I had a couple of people who were like, there are so many posts on Reddit, there's a real problem with this test. And I was like, I've been sitting here talking to students for about 4 hours now. And I actually was of the opinion that this actually was one of the better tests that I've seen over the last year. So it depends upon the source of information that you have. And there's biases in who's going to reach out to me as well. So
Yeah, sure.
I'm not saying either one of them is definitive, but in the end, the numbers that they released support the fact that there wasn't anything strange going on. And that kind of explains, hey, there's got to be a different reason that we saw those posts on Reddit. And I think you and I probably tracked it down pretty well here.
Yeah, so let's talk about more plausible reasons then.
All right, I'll let you go to the next one.
All right. Well, to me, the one that always jumps first and foremost into my mind when I hear that people struggled on this test, whether it's a small drop or something monumental, is I want to know about their anxiety levels. I want to know about their mentality going through it. How are you feeling? How well did you connect with the test? You and I have talked at length about mentality and the role that it plays and how it's often either overlooked or at least downplayed when in fact it's one of the most critical aspects of a performance. But anxiety is always the one that I think of first. Is like, this genuinely can have the kind of effect, negative or positive, that a lot of people saw.
Yeah, and this is something that especially comes into play on real test results versus your practice test results.
Yes.
So many times what you're seeing people say is, well, I had a practice test average of this, and then on the real thing, I went down. That's not actually surprising or unusual to some extent. When you sit down to take the real LSAT, you know it's real. You can't avoid that fact. It's staring you right in the face that this counts. This is going down on the so-called permanent record, even though it's only 5 years. And so you get that kind of fear factor, and that can have an immediate effect. And I think I've said this before, is that when I talk to students post-test, the way they describe their experience often can give me an early warning that they may have had some type of issue. If somebody says to me, I just don't remember anything about it, it was a blur, I'm deeply worried immediately. In my experience, when people have had that kind of test day experience, it's because they got lost and they weren't really in the moment. And so they don't remember the questions. They don't have a really clear understanding of how they performed. They're like, well, it felt okay. But they couldn't even tell you like what the topic of any of the reading comprehension was. I'm like, were you really there with the test, or were you just reacting and trying to hold on during the moment? And that's a really normal experience. By contrast, a lot of times people will come back and be like, oh, I remember everything. And oftentimes their perception of difficulty, their own performance, tends to be far more accurate because they were completely engaged and in the moment with the exam, and they remember a lot. So you have to ask yourself, if you had a score drop here, how did you feel after the test? Did it feel like a blur? Because if it did, it's probably that anxiety got to you and you froze, or something happened where you're just like, you weren't able to function the way you normally would. That's at least useful knowledge, and you can prepare for that going forward. And the next time you take this test, be aware of it and try to counter it with various steps. And John, you and I post on test mentality and test anxiety quite a bit. There's numerous blog posts that we've written. I think we put together the ultimate test mentality list, which has a ton of articles, all sorts of things. We've done webinars on it. It's a topic that we spend a lot of time with because we know how really pernicious it is. If this is affecting you, it comes out of the blue, and it can really be a huge reversal of fortune, and it's unexpected for some people. They don't even realize they've actually had that happen to them.
Yeah, I love that as a litmus test of sorts, this notion of how much you can recall or how well connected. It's the difference really being in the driver's seat or in the trunk. It's funny, the last phone call that I had before you and I hopped on to start recording this was with not a student of ours, just a student who was debating canceling her score. It was her first time she had score preview. She knows what she got. But she is going to cancel now because her score dropped about 9 points from her average. And she had listened to a prior episode where we talked about this exact thing. I think you were talking about this fugue state, essentially, where people come out of the test as though someone's just awoken from a coma. And I don't know what happened. I barely remember my section order. I don't know passage topics. I don't know, how I was with time. It really just feels like you were blindfolded, being drug along the whole way. And that was exactly her experience. She's like, nothing has ever resonated or described my test day better than that. She's like, it is a mystery to me even now, upon reflection, what happened. I have no idea. I barely recall taking it, she said.
Yeah, and I would like to point out that this isn't something that afflicts just a certain scoring range. This happens to people at all levels.
Oh yeah, she was a PT 172, 174, and scored in the low 160s. So I mean, this is a girl who knew what she was doing until she didn't.
But these exams are known as high stakes exams because they have such an impact on your future. And if you think about that right away, high stakes, it means you know that this is a big deal. And once your body and your mind knows that, it will sometimes react in odd ways. You get into that fight or flight mentality a little bit. And sometimes people take a mental flight from the test without even realizing that they're doing it, just because the pressure feels overwhelming. You have to prepare for that and at least understand it. In the same way, you wouldn't want to run a marathon without practicing with it first and understanding what the distance and the route was.
Yeah,
that's what we have here. So I think your student example there is perfect for this.
Yeah, I'm not sure she'll love hearing more about herself if she listens to this, but she made the right decision to cancel, and she learned a lot from having gone through this. It's going to be one of the most useful notches in her particular belt. So she's taking it again in October, and I encouraged her to sign up for November 2, just for the cushion.
Yeah, can't hurt.
She'll hit her number. She'll get there. She's clearly a very smart person and talking to her. But yeah, this test was, man, it blindsided her in the worst way.
Yeah, and just keep in mind, only your high score counts. Doesn't matter. So if you had that reversal of fortune and it's on your record, that's okay. Go back, take the test again, get a more representative score, and it washes away the history of this.
Yeah, it's the ultimate eraser of sorts. You mentioned test mentality, and it just occurred to me, for anyone who wants to hear more about this, if they don't want to go into our back catalog, we have got an upcoming webinar on September 26th, all about test mentality. So you can go to our free webinars page, sign up for that. It'll be free. It's live. You'll get a copy of the recording after the fact. September 26th, if you guys want to hear this really comprehensively covered, that webinar is great.
Excellent. Any other reasons you could think that would drive a score down?
I can think of one other. I could probably think of lots more than one other, but one other definitely stands above the rest, which is maybe there was genuinely something about this test that wasn't just difficult, but was like sneakily or almost unnoticed in terms of its difficulty. We've seen this happen before. where people think they did a lot better than they did because they didn't realize they were being fooled throughout.
Yeah, we've specifically referred to this in certain logical reasoning sections.
Yep.
Because in reading comp and logic games, my feeling is people are pretty good in gauging difficulty because there's only 4 of each type, only 4 games, only 4 passages. You can get a sense of like, this is hard, it's hard to read, or I don't understand that rule. Like the difficulty tends to hit you more directly. In LR, we talked about the test from the fall of 2018 being really elusive and sneaky in terms of like, wow, that's harder than you think it is. And then there's a wrong answer that is perfectly matched to a misunderstanding of the problem.
Yep.
And it is possible that some individuals had that and the difficulty got past them in a way that they didn't realize. And again, that's not a criticism. It's more that does happen. It's more a testament to how good the people are who make this test.
That's right.
They're world-class in terms of test construction and kind of like idea presentation.
Yeah,
so
and just general elusiveness, I think. Man, they can disguise right and wrong answers so wonderfully well.
And some tests have more of those problems than others. And it's the classic example, we've talked about it, where I'll look at tests after the fact and think, wow, that caught a bunch of people off guard. I bet they chose B. And then I'll go look at the test data later on in our system after we've had a bunch of people take it. I'll be like, yep, they're just choosing that answer at a really high rate. And that's part of the value of analytics, by the way, is being able to go back and break down tests like that and think, what did I miss or what were they trying to do? But you can go through certain questions on the LSAT and everybody has had this experience and think, I got that right. And then you look back at it later on, you're like, I missed it. You're like surprised. Like, how did I miss number 11? And you go back and you look at it and you're like, oh, sometimes that happens at a really high rate in these sections. Other times it doesn't. But maybe this was a test that had a bunch of those types of questions.
Right. Yeah, you alluded to these 2 tests. I'll be a little more explicit about it. The September and November 2018 logical reasoning sections, all 4 of those sections, were ones that really stand out in my mind as some of the most stark instances of this. I heard over and over people talking about, and because both those tests were released, people could actually see their results. They could get in there and compare directly how they did on those tests versus what they had done previously. And over, I was seeing people report things like, man, I never missed more than 1 or 2 logical reasoning. I felt great today. -9, -12.
Ouch.
Those tests just beat people up, but in the most like unexpected or unnoticed ways. And in fact, I remember people have heard me say this before. You probably recall it too, Dave. When we got our hands on those 2 tests, again, seeing the discrepancies between how people felt they did and what actually happened. You and I think we're on the phone looking through some of the LR, just making classic noises of like grudging respect, really, of like, oh, look at C. Oh, God, look at E. It was moment after moment of that where it was just like, you could see exactly what the test makers had done to people, to the, less savvy test takers out there. It was wicked.
Those are 2 sections, or at least 2 tests, where we often
4.
tell people, go look at those sections. And I know during that period of time, I like so many of those questions, I went out and wrote a bunch of explanations for them myself that are on our free LSAT forum.
Yeah.
Because I was like, gosh, I really would like to talk about this. This is a cool thing that they've done, or a really tricky wrong answer, or an answer that's right, but a lot of people don't feel comfortable with. I wanted to get in there and explain a lot of that because that is something that I find enjoyable, perversely. And so that's the kind of tests where you really would go back and look at it. You could have had something like that here. I hope not. And I hope that whatever happened was, pointing to somewhere else. And the data does suggest that these tests weren't just brutally difficult, but were actually rather fair. So that kind of, I would say, John, I'm not sure I can think of too many other possible reasons that are systemic in nature here. Obviously, people can have bad days. Sometimes you wake up and you just don't feel well. You've got a cold. Your neighbors are loud. You have an internet connection problem. All those are causes, but they're so obvious and material that we're not going to list them out here or kind of debate them. If your neighbors are screaming, yeah, it probably affected your score.
Right. Yeah, the student that I was talking to this morning said that she had gone for a little walk right before a test to clear her head around the block, and she came home and one of her roommates had somehow started a grease fire in the kitchen. And so literally 20 minutes before she's meant to take this test, she's in there trying to put a fire out, a literal fire, not just the figurative ones that people see.
And that could possibly have an impact, I would think.
I suggested that to her.
It's like something weird happened right before you started the test.
Yeah.
Do you think it might have affected you? Because
is it possible you were distracted by the fact that you had no visibility in the apartment from the smoke?
All right.
She's like, yeah. She said I was coughing through the test. I was like, yeah, I think we might have found at least one culprit.
Yeah. Point to the obvious. That's Occam's razor right there. What's the most obvious explanation? Maybe that weird thing that happened just beforehand.
Yeah. The last point I'll make, and again, we've probably kind of alluded to this, but I'll make it more explicit. We're not going to get a copy of these tests. People aren't going to actually get their raw scores, no matter what they release here, hopefully pre-October with PT90. Even if it is, as I suspect it could be, a form from the October 2020 reused in August test, you still won't know unless you can remember it somehow. You still won't know exactly how you did. You'll know your score. You'll be able to look at the curve for that test, and if you had that test, apply it to your score. But it's not going to give you a raw score breakdown, section by section, etc. So all of these, unfortunately, seem destined to remain speculative.
It's all theoretical, man.
Yeah. That also means we can't be wrong.
I'll take that every day of the week. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. If you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating. And if you have any questions for us, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. I'm sure there will be a mailbag coming up relatively soon. On behalf of John and myself, thanks for listening. Have a great week. Stay safe out there.